Paige Whitmore had $40.17. That's it. $40 she'd scraped together over 3 weeks, one crumpled bill at a time, stuffed into an old Altoids tin at the bottom of her bag. She was 27, a waitress pulling double shifts at a diner on Chicago's South Side, 3 months behind on rent, raising her 81-year-old grandfather who couldn't remember her name half the time, but still called her sweetheart like he knew exactly who she was. $40 wasn't money, it was a promise. It was Friday's rent negotiation. It was one more week before the landlord changed the locks. And then a blind woman walked into her restaurant. She was 63, trembling, her milky white eyes staring at nothing, her fingers reaching for walls that weren't there. She'd been lost for 5 hours. She couldn't see the menu. She couldn't find her wallet. She asked for the cheapest thing they had, and when she admitted she couldn't pay, the manager told her to leave. A customer laughed. Another one looked away. The cook leaned out from the kitchen, saw everything, and went back to his grill. 25 people in that room, and not a single one moved. Except Paige. She didn't think about the rent. She didn't think about Friday. She knelt on that dirty tile floor, held a stranger's hand, and spent every cent she had to feed a woman the whole room had decided wasn't worth touching. They fired her for it. She walked home in the dark with nothing. No job, no money, no plan. Just a woman who'd made a choice that was about to cost her everything, or change her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Because that blind woman on the restaurant floor? She wasn't homeless. She wasn't a stranger wandering in off the street. She was Celeste Valenti, the mother of Nico Valenti, 36 years old, owner of half the real estate on the Gold Coast, a man whose name made powerful men go quiet in rooms she'd never be invited into. By morning, he'd watched the security footage 7 times. By morning, he knew her name. By morning, the most dangerous man in Chicago was standing in her apartment, and nothing, not her life, not his empire, not the darkness he carried would ever be the same. If this story moves you, leave a like so others can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the beginning before the blind woman walked through that door. Before the $40. Before the man in the black car, let's talk about who Paige Whitmore really was. 5:30 in the morning. Chicago hadn't woken yet, but Paige Whitmore had already opened her eyes. She didn't need an alarm. Her body had been programmed by 8 years of waking before the sun, by a fear she never named but always carried with her each time she closed her eyes. The fear that one morning, her grandfather would no longer be breathing. The first thing she did every day, before her feet even touched the cold floor, was lean toward the bed beside hers, place the back of her hand in front of Walt Whitmore's nose, and count. 1, 2, 3. 3 breaths. Warm, steady, still here. Only then did her shoulders loosen. Only then did she begin a new day. Only then did she allow herself to believe that today wasn't the day she would lose one more person. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building with no elevator on the south side of Chicago. Cracks ran down the walls from the ceiling to the windows like veins on an old person's hand. Paint peeled away in patches, revealing the gray cement underneath. The window had been taped against the wind since the winter before, and now the tape had yellowed, and no one had bothered to take it down. The apartment was so small that from the kitchen you could see the bed, and from the bed you could reach out and touch the refrigerator. But it was home. It was the only thing standing between the two of them and the sidewalk. Paige got up and walked barefoot across the cold tile floor to the corner kitchen. On the shelf, between boxes of food that were nearly empty and a jar of salt scraped close to the bottom, sat an aluminum Vietnamese coffee filter. Old, dented on one side, its handle worn smooth by the years. It was the only keepsake left from her mother. Not a ring, not a photograph, not a letter. A coffee filter her mother had used every morning, standing by the window, looking outside while she waited for the coffee to drip. Paige remembered that smell more clearly than she remembered her mother's face. 8 years had passed, and her mother's face had slowly blurred in her memory, but the scent of coffee brewed through that filter had never changed. She made herself a cup. Black, no sugar, no milk, not because she liked it that way, but because the sugar had run out the week before, and milk was a luxury she had taken off the grocery list a long time ago. She drank it standing up, leaning her back against the sink, listening to the water leaking from the kitchen faucet. Once every 4 seconds. Drip, drip, drip. She had fixed it twice, wrapped it with tape, tightened the screw, replaced the washer with a piece of rubber cut from the sole of an old slipper. It still leaked. Every 4 seconds. Steady as the second heartbeat of this apartment, Walt woke at 6 o'clock. She heard the wheelchair creak before she heard his voice. Paige had already placed a warm towel on the arm of the wheelchair, soaking it in hot water, wringing it dry, folding it neatly, setting it exactly where his hand could reach. She didn't wash his face for him. Never. He was Walt Whitmore, a printer for 40 years at the largest printing house on the South Side, the man who had once set lead type by hand faster than any machine, the man who had raised his daughter alone after his wife died young, then raised his granddaughter alone after his daughter followed his wife into the grave. He had grown slower. His memory came and went, like a radio signal, sometimes clear and sharp, sometimes fading away in the middle of a sentence. But he wasn't a man who needed someone to wash his face for him. Paige knew that, so she left the towel there, and he picked it up himself, wiped his own face, and the two of them pretended it was the most ordinary thing in the world. That was how Paige preserved his dignity without saying a single word. "Good morning, Grandpa. That you, sweetheart? It's always me." Every morning, the same 3 sentences, the same voice, the same brief silence in between, when Walt tried to remember who she was before instinct answered for him. Paige opened the newspaper she had picked up on her way home the night before. A Tribune someone had left behind on a bus stop bench. Wrinkled, missing a few pages, but still a newspaper. She sat beside Walt and read to him. Anything at all. Foreign exchange rates, baseball results, a report about a fire in the West Loop that he would forget in another 10 minutes. It didn't matter. Walt had been a printer. He loved the smell of newsprint the way people loved the perfume of someone they had lost. Every time Paige opened the paper, he took a deep breath. His eyes brightened for a few seconds, and she knew that somewhere inside the fog, slowly swallowing his memory, there was still a part of him that remembered who he was. "Read that part again, sweetheart." Even though she had just read the professional basketball standings, even though he didn't understand a word of it, he only wanted to hear her voice a little longer. Paige read it again. She always read it again. She made him a bowl of oatmeal cooked the night before and warmed it in a small pot on the stove. In her apron pocket, the few coins inside the Altoids tin clinked softly against the crumpled bills. She didn't eat. She said she would eat at work. She wouldn't. On the kitchen wall, 3 rent notices were taped in a row. White, creased, printed with bold red letters, like a countdown clock made of paper. The first month, the second month, the third month. Pete Garza, the landlord, had called twice the week before. Paige answered once. He gave her until Friday. Friday was 2 days away. She washed her coffee cup, turned it upside down on the shelf beside her mother's coffee filter, looked once more at the 3 pieces of paper on the wall, then turned away and tied up her hair. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because once the fear was done, she still had to go to work. Paige Whitmore hadn't always been the girl standing by the sink, drinking black coffee at 5:30 in the morning. There was another version of her, a version that, if she met her now, she wouldn't recognize. At 18, Paige graduated valedictorian from South Shore High School, standing on stage in a borrowed graduation gown 2 sizes too big, reading a speech she had written and rewritten 7 times on the backs of old bills. 2 colleges offered her scholarships. 2 letters lay on the kitchen table, the kind printed on thick paper with the school logo raised enough to feel under your fingers, the kind Paige opened and read to Walt 3 times because he kept asking her to read it again, not because he hadn't heard her clearly, but because he wanted to hear it one more time to make sure he wasn't dreaming. That summer, Paige had started folding clothes into a suitcase. She had written her name on her book labels. She had imagined the dorm room, the roommate, the lecture halls, the library open until midnight. She had believed her life was about to begin. Then her mother went to the doctor for a cough that wouldn't go away. And life truly did begin, just not in the way Paige had imagined. Stage 4, lung cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the moment her mother closed her eyes. 11 weeks. Not enough time to prepare. Not enough time to accept it. Only enough time for Paige to learn how to change hospital sheets, how to blend food into liquid because her mother couldn't swallow anymore, how to hold the hand of someone who was dying without crying in front of them, because she was afraid her tears would frighten her mother. Paige was 19 when her mother died. Her father had been gone long before that, not gone in the sense of dead, but gone in the sense of walking out the door when she was 4 years old and never coming back. She didn't remember his face. didn't remember his voice, only a pair of brown leather shoes stepping over the threshold, and her mother sitting on the kitchen floor for a very long time afterward. At 4, Paige didn't understand what had happened. At 27, she understood it too well. Some people leave not because they don't love, but because staying requires something they don't have. After the funeral, Walt collapsed inside himself. He stopped reading the newspaper, stopped leaving the house, stopped remembering dates, then stopped remembering his daughter's name. And then there were mornings when he looked at Paige, as though she were a stranger who had knocked on the wrong door. The doctor said neurodegeneration, said old age, said grief-related stress, said many long words that all meant the same thing in the end. Walt was slowly losing himself, and there was no way to stop it. Paige looked at the 2 scholarship letters on the table, looked at Walt sitting motionless by the window, his eyes turned outside but seeing nothing. There was no one else. No uncles, no aunts, no neighbors willing to carry the weight of an 80-year-old man who was slowly forgetting the world. Only her. She folded the 2 letters, put them back in their envelopes, and wrote to turn down both schools. Then she went looking for a waitressing job at the nearest restaurant, with a help wanted sign in the window, tied on an apron, clocked into a shift. That was 8 years ago. 8 years of walking 35 minutes every morning, from the apartment on 47th Street to the restaurant on 63rd Street. The bus was $2.25 one way, $4.50 round trip. $4.50 was a loaf of bread, a box of oatmeal, Walt's dinner tomorrow. So she walked. In summer, the heat softened the asphalt beneath her shoes. In winter, the wind off Lake Michigan cut through every layer of clothing as if there were no layers at all. She still walked. The shoes she wore were the only sneakers she owned, bought at a Goodwill thrift store 3 years earlier for $4. The left one had come apart at the toe. She glued it. It came apart again. She glued it again. It came apart again. Now she tucked a piece of cardboard inside so the rain wouldn't soak up into her sock, and she called that fixed. Every morning, she walked past the older, grander houses on King Drive, the kind with weathered but neatly trimmed lawns, warm porch lights, cars parked in driveways instead of on the street, the kind of houses whose prices she knew exactly, because she had once stopped to read a for sale sign and then never read one again. She passed Corpus Christi Catholic Church on 49th Street, where she and Walt used to go to Mass every Sunday, before the wheelchair turned 17 stone steps into an impossible wall. She passed the gas station on the corner of Ashland, where a night shift clerk had once told her she was too pretty to be this poor, as if poverty were something meant only for ugly people, as if beauty were a ticket she had simply chosen not to use. She didn't answer. She just walked faster. And every morning, when she arrived, she stopped in front of the restaurant door, took a breath, and pulled the smile onto her face. Not a fake smile, not a real smile either. Something in between, something she had practiced for 8 years until it became a reflex, like tying on her apron, like remembering the orders for 16 tables without writing them down. That smile cost her a great deal of strength. But she still gave it away, every morning, every shift, every day, because if she didn't smile, no one would smile at her. And if no one smiled at her, she was afraid she would forget what it felt like. 6:50 in the morning. Paige pushed open the back door of Crossing Point Grill, 10 minutes early as she was every day. Always 10 minutes. Because being late was something she couldn't allow herself, and being right on time still wasn't enough to keep Karen Driscoll from finding a reason to frown. Karen stood behind the cash register, 46 years old, her hair clipped neatly back, her white shirt buttoned all the way to the collar, the kind of woman whose smile should worry you more than her silence. Karen didn't hate Paige. Hate required caring, and Karen didn't care about anyone enough to hate them. She simply saw Paige the way she saw a table rag, useful when needed, replaceable at any moment, and not worth remembering by name unless absolutely necessary. Section 4. 2 words, without looking up. Section 4 was the dead corner of the restaurant, right beside the kitchen door and the hallway to the restrooms. The smell of grease from the kitchen mixed with the smell of cleaner from the toilet, the clatter of dishes, the roar of the exhaust fan, the kitchen door swinging open and shut over and over, hot, loud, and low in tips. Because no one wanted to eat beside a door someone walked through every 3 minutes on the way to the restroom. Section 4 was where Karen put the employees whose loyalty she didn't need to keep. Paige had worked Section 4 so often. She knew every crack in the tile floor, knew exactly which table had the wobbly chair leg that needed an extra pad beneath it, Knew the lamp on table 12 flickered every time the dishwasher inside started its spin cycle. "All right," Paige said. She put her purse in the employee locker in the back, the metal locker with no lock that everyone knew shouldn't hold anything valuable, then took out the bag of oatmeal left from yesterday and set it on the shared shelf. Ray Hoffman, the head cook, 38 years old, beer-bellied, his apron stained with oil from morning until night, saw the bag and smirked. "Oatmeal again? How many days in a row now? 3 or 4? A prep cook behind Ray gave a low snicker. Paige didn't answer. She washed her hands, dried them, and started clearing tables. She had learned a long time ago that silence in front of Ray wasn't weakness. It was saving energy. Energy she needed for 16 tables. For 12 hours standing on shoes with soles coming apart. For the smile she had to pull onto her face every morning like drawing back a curtain. Maggie Dunn came in at 7 o'clock. 33 years old, brown hair twisted into a high bun, the kind of woman who spoke so bluntly that sometimes you wanted to cover your ears, yet still felt grateful, because she was the only person who didn't talk about you behind your back. Maggie was the only waitress in this restaurant who treated Paige like a human being, not a table rag. She walked past Paige without stopping, but a small bread roll wrapped in a napkin slipped into Paige's apron pocket, as fast as a street magic trick. "Eat something decent." "Maggie, I'm fine." "You're not fine, but you're stubborn, so just take it." Paige took the bread, not because she was hungry, though she was, but because she knew refusing Maggie took more strength than accepting. The morning shift began. Paige served 16 tables. She remembered every order without writing anything down, a habit sharpened by 8 years of repetition, by the fact that in those first few months she had written too slowly, and Karen had nearly fired her, so she'd been forced to remember everything in her head. And now it had become almost the only superpower she had. Table 2. Eggs well done, no onions, black coffee with an extra shot. Table 5. Blueberry pancakes, crispy bacon, orange juice, with no ice. Table 9. Coffee only, sits for 2 hours, tips $1. She cleaned up 2 spills, 1 glass of orange juice and 1 bowl of soup. She returned a fallen spoon to a child and smiled at the young mother who was so tired she forgot to say thank you. Paige didn't mind. She understood that kind of tired. At 2:15 in the afternoon, in the middle of her shift, Paige stepped into the employee restroom, locked the door, sat on the toilet lid, opened her purse, and took out an old Altoids tin. The lid was so worn the printed letters had almost disappeared. She opened it. Wrinkled bills, coins, folded, creased, rolled up, crowded together inside the little tin box that fit in the palm of her hand. She counted. Every single cent, $40.17. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of skipping lunch. 3 weeks of walking the longer way home so she wouldn't pass the grocery store. 3 weeks of pushing aside $1 here, $2 there, sometimes only a few loose coins, tucking them into this tin, as though she were placing hope inside a little metal coffin. $40. Not enough to pay 3 months of back rent, but enough to put the money in front of Pete Garza, look him straight in the eye, and say, "Give me 1 more week." Enough to breathe for 7 more days. She closed the lid, tucked the tin into her apron pocket, right beside the bread roll Maggie had slipped her that morning and she still hadn't eaten. "Friday," she whispered. Then she stood, washed her hands, opened the door, pulled the smile onto her face, and stepped back out. 3:47 in the afternoon. The restaurant bell rang. Paige was carrying 2 plates back to Section 4 when she heard it. It wasn't an unusual bell, nor was the person stepping inside unusual, but something made her turn her head. An old woman stood in the doorway, her right hand feeling blindly in front of her, her left hand gripping the doorframe, her clouded white eyes staring into nothing. You already know what happened after that, but you don't yet know what it took from her. The old woman didn't walk in. She felt her way in, 1 step at a time, her right hand raised in front of her, groping through the air as though searching for something to hold on to when there was nothing there. Her left hand tracing the edge of the wall, then losing the wall, then finding it again. Her eyes were cloudy white, looking nowhere at all, looking at no one at all, only open like 2 windows painted shut from the inside. Her clothes sat crooked on her body, her coat buttoned wrong, her silver hair falling loose to one side, but anyone with a sharp eye would have noticed that the fabric wasn't cheap, the stitching wasn't bargain rack work, and those shoes, dirty as they were still real leather. But no one in that restaurant had an eye that sharp. All they saw was a blind old woman stepping into a place that wasn't hers. Celeste felt her way to an empty chair, sat down, and placed her trembling hands on the tabletop as if to confirm the table was real, as if to prove she was sitting somewhere and not still lost out on the street. She had been lost for 5 hours. 5 hours in a city she couldn't see, couldn't remember, couldn't understand where she was. Her wallet had fallen somewhere along the way, and she didn't know when. Her phone was in her wallet. She had nothing left but trembling hands and a voice wearing itself thin. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite, the kind of voice that belonged to someone used to speaking with others, used to being served, used to being heard. But now it sounded weak and lost, like a radio tuned to the wrong station. "May I have a glass of water? And the cheapest thing you have?" No waitress came. The server in Section 2 glanced over, then looked at Karen. Karen walked from the register to Celeste's table, carrying no menu, carrying no glass of water. "Do you have money to pay?" Celeste searched the pockets of her coat, searched the pockets of her pants. Her hands fumbled through the small handbag, opening it, turning through every compartment, her trembling fingers looking for the wallet she didn't know she had lost. Nothing. Nothing at all. "I think I've misplaced. If you can't pay, you can't sit here. This isn't a shelter." Karen's voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough for the next table to hear. A man at table 3 looked over, shook his head, and turned back to his meal. A woman at table 6 pulled her daughter closer into her lap, as though blindness were something that could spread. Then came the laughter. From a man sitting near the window, a low little laugh, not cruel in the way he thought of cruelty, but cruel in the way the world works. How'd she even find her way in here if she can't see? Another voice, a woman's, softer but still loud enough to hear. "Call somebody. Call the police or something." Celeste heard all of it. She couldn't see anything, but she heard everything. Heard the laughter. Heard chairs scraping a few inches farther away from her. Heard the silence of 25 people deciding she wasn't their problem. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled. Her hand reached for the back of the chair but missed, grasping at empty air, and she fell. Not hard, not with her head striking the floor, just crumpling down onto the tile like someone who had used every bit of strength merely to stay upright and now had nothing left to use. She lay there, her shoulders shaking, her hands searching for something to hold on to. But all around her there was only cold floor and empty air. The restaurant went silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the kind of silence that happens when everyone sees and no one wants to be the one who has to do something. Ray Hoffman stood in the kitchen doorway, looking out, looking at Celeste on the floor, looking at Karen with her arms folded, then chose to step back inside, shutting his eyes to the world just like he always did. Paige was carrying 2 plates back to Section 4. She stopped, set the plates down on the nearest table, and walked straight to the old woman on the floor. She didn't think. If she had thought, she would have thought of the Altoids tin, thought of 3 weeks, thought of Friday, thought of Pete Garza and the 3 pieces of paper on the kitchen wall, and Walt sitting alone in the 3rd-floor apartment waiting for her to come home. If she had thought, maybe she wouldn't have gone. But she didn't think. She only saw a human being on the floor whom no one would touch. She knelt down. "I'm here. I'm right here. Don't be scared." Celeste's hand found Paige's arm and gripped it tight. So tight that Paige felt the old woman's fingernails press into her skin. "I can't see. I don't know where I am. You're safe now. When was the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning." "Maybe." Paige heard her own heart beating. Not fast. Slow. Heavy. 1 beat at a time, like the leaking faucet in her kitchen at home. She stood, walked to the corner of the restaurant, opened her purse, and took out the Altoids tin. Opened the lid. 3 weeks were inside it. Every dollar. Every lunch she had skipped. Every longer road she had walked home. Every night she had lain there counting and counting again, and then counting one more time. $40.17. She poured all of it into her palm. Then she walked to the register. Karen looked at her. Ray watched from the kitchen doorway. 25 people sat in silence, watching, but not one of them moved. Paige ordered grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, a glass of water, and warm bread. She paid with everything she had. She brought the plate over, sat down on the floor beside Celeste, gently lifted the old woman's head, and brought the glass of water to her lips. Celeste drank in small, slow sips, like someone who had forgotten how to swallow and was learning all over again. Then she ate, slowly, one bite at a time. Her hand still held Paige's arm and didn't let go, as though she were afraid that if she loosened her grip, the only person who had touched her would disappear. Someone at the bar shook his head. "This is a restaurant, not a charity shelter." Maggie stood a little ways behind them, both hands over her mouth, her eyes red. She wanted to step forward, but Karen had already walked over. "I gave you a chance, Paige." Paige didn't look up. Her hand held the glass of water for Celeste. "You want to sit on my floor playing hero? That's up to you. But you don't work here anymore." Paige didn't react. She held the glass until Celeste swallowed the last sip. Then she said softly, "Eat slowly, all right? Don't rush." Celeste gripped her hand tighter. Her cloudy white eyes lifted, seeing nothing, yet finding Paige's face in exactly the right direction, as though she could see with something other than her eyes. "What's your name?" "Paige. Paige." The old woman repeated it slowly, as if carving that name into the deepest place of her failing memory. "I'll remember that name. Even if I forget everything else, I'll remember that name." Paige gently loosened Celeste's hand and stood. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, set it on the counter. Then she walked out the door. No arguing, no crying, no looking back. Just a woman who had made a choice and carried it through the door with empty hands and an empty Altoids tin in her purse. It was already dark when Paige stepped out of the restaurant. Not the kind of darkness that belonged to sunset, but the kind that made it feel as though the day had ended long ago and no one had bothered to tell her. She walked, 35 minutes, the same road she took every morning, only in reverse, and everything looked different when you were walking toward a place where nothing was waiting. No $40 in her pocket. No morning shift tomorrow. No answer for Pete Garza when he called on Friday. Friday would still come. Friday didn't care what she had just lost. She passed the gas station on the corner of Ashland. Neon lights flickering in the glass. The night shift clerk sitting behind the counter, looking at his phone. She passed the grand houses on King Drive. The porch lights still warm. The lawns still neatly trimmed. And the distance between her life and the lives behind those doors had never felt wider than it did now. She passed Corpus Christi Church. And she stopped. Not because she wanted to pray. She didn't know whether she still believed in anything worth praying to. She only needed to sit. Only needed to stop somewhere between the restaurant she had just lost and the apartment she was about to lose. Somewhere that wasn't really anywhere, just long enough to breathe. 17 stone steps. The steps she and Walt could no longer climb after the wheelchair became part of his life. She sat on the third step, the lowest one, her back against the cold stone column. The streetlight above her buzzed, that steady hum of something old, as though it couldn't decide whether to keep shining or go dark for good. She sat there for a long time. She didn't know how long, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. Time meant nothing when you had nowhere you needed to be and no one waiting for you. But someone was waiting. She knew that, so she stood and kept walking. The third-floor apartment. 3 flights of stairs, no elevator. She climbed 1 step at a time, the loose sole of her shoe dragging across each stair, and when she opened the door, Walt was sitting in his wheelchair beside the window, looking out, though outside there was only darkness and the roof of the building across the way. He always sat there when she came home late. She didn't know whether he remembered why he was sitting there, whether he remembered who he was waiting for, or whether it was only an old habit his body had kept after his memory had let go. "You're late, sweetheart." "I know, Grandpa. I'm sorry." She said nothing more. She didn't tell him about the restaurant, didn't tell him about the blind old woman, didn't tell him about the Altoids tin, didn't tell him that tomorrow morning she would wake up and, for the first time in 8 years, have nowhere to go. She opened the kitchen cabinet. The last can of soup. She poured it into a pot, warmed it, and divided it into 2 bowls. Walt's bowl was bigger, always bigger. She set the bowl in front of him, sat down in the chair across from him, and they ate in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. The silence of 2 people who had lived together long enough not to need words to fill the empty spaces. The sound of spoons touching bowls, the sound of swallowing, the creak of the wheelchair each time Walt shifted slightly. Then Walt set his spoon down. His eyes were bright. One of those clear moments, the kind that came without warning and left without asking permission, when the fog in his mind parted, and he was himself, entirely, sharply, like the man who had once set lead type faster than a machine, who had once read the paper every morning, who had once known his granddaughter's name before she even opened the door. "You did something good today, didn't you?" Paige looked at him. How do you know? Because you have that look. Just like your mother used to. Like the world has just taken something from you, but you gave something bigger away. Paige's throat closed. She couldn't speak. She only held his hand on the table, holding tight, the way she placed her hand in front of his nose every morning and counted 3 breaths, because she needed to know he was still here, still real, still the only person in the world who saw her. They cleared the bowls. Paige pushed Walt's wheelchair closer to the bed, covered him with the blanket, adjusted his pillow. Walt took her hand before she turned away, his eyes still bright, still clear, as though he knew this door of lucidity was about to close and he wanted to say one more thing before the fog came back. Truth doesn't need noise, sweetheart. It only needs time. Then he closed his eyes, and that clear moment left as gently as it had come, leaving Walt asleep and Paige standing alone in the dim yellow spill of the kitchen light. She turned off the light, didn't turn on her phone, didn't calculate, didn't make a plan. She sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the lower cabinet, her knees drawn up, in complete darkness. She didn't cry. She wanted to cry, but nothing came out, as though her body had used up everything it had for the day and was now empty as the Altoids tin lying on the table an arm's length away, its lid open, nothing left inside. In the dark, the only sound was the leaking kitchen faucet. 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. Steady, patient, unhurried, not stopping, as though it were counting something Paige couldn't see. She sat there until the darkness was no longer something surrounding her, but something she was inside. And across the city, in a penthouse on the 30th floor overlooking Lake Michigan, a man was watching and rewatching a video on the only glowing screen in a dark room. But that is the story of the next part. That same night, a 20-minute drive from Paige's apartment but as far away as another planet, on the 30th floor of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, Nico Valenti was tearing his office apart. Not in the shouting, out-of-control way. In silence, the more dangerous kind. He shoved the oak desk until it flipped over, and the glass top shattered across the marble floor. He swept one hand across the bookshelf, sending dozens of books crashing down like dominoes. He threw a glass of whiskey at the wall, not because he wanted to hear it break, but because his hand needed to do something besides clench, until the white of bone seemed ready to rise beneath the skin. Not a word, no shouting, no cursing. Only heavy breathing and the sound of objects exploding in the darkness of the penthouse, where the city lights spilled through the glass walls like a painting he had never bothered to look at. Frankie Corsaro stood outside the door, his back against the wall, arms folded over his chest, his face expressionless. 44 years old, salt and pepper hair, a scar across the back of his right hand from a night in Cicero, 15 years earlier, that he had never told anyone about. Frankie had stood outside this door through many nights like this. He knew when to step in and when to wait. Tonight was a night for waiting. Nico Valenti, 36 years old. Search his name on Google and you would find the chairman of Valenti Holdings, commercial real estate, upscale restaurant chains, hotel investments, photographs of him in a dark suit in Chicago business magazines, shaking hands with a congressman, making donations to a children's hospital. But ask anyone who did business on the South Side, in Cicero, on the streets Google Maps didn't photograph clearly, and you would receive a different answer, not in words. In the way they looked around before saying his name, in the way they lowered their voices, in the way certain questions were the kind a wise person didn't ask. His father, Angelo Valenti, had been shot dead inside the family's own restaurant on a Tuesday night, 8 years earlier. 3 shots. Chest, head, professional, clean. The person who ordered it was never found, at least not by the police. Nico found him. Nico had been 28 then, freshly graduated with a degree in finance, newly returned after 2 years in London, thinking he would build an empire with Excel spreadsheets and clean contracts. Then his father died, and spreadsheets became what he used to launder money. Clean contracts became a shell, and Nico Valenti became the very thing his father had spent 28 years trying to hide him from. He rebuilt the Valenti empire not with loyalty, with fear, with systems, with one simple rule. No one was allowed close enough to hurt him. No partners, no friends, no women, no one. There was only one exception. Celeste Valenti, 63 years old. His mother, she had macular degeneration, her sight fading little by little over the past 3 years, from blurred to smeared to almost entirely blind. Lately, there had also been signs of early-stage Alzheimer's, gaps in her memory growing wider and wider, like holes in cloth slowly rotting through. Nico hired a care team 24/7, private nurses, a neurologist, a nutrition chef, a personal driver. She was the only soft thing left in his life, the only thing he couldn't control with fear or money, the only thing he could look at without his jaw hardening and his eyes turning into two black stones. And today, someone had lost her. Tommy Farrow, 29 years old, the personal driver, had been assigned to take Celeste to the hospital for her routine eye exam at 10 in the morning. At noon, Tommy called Frankie. Mrs. Valenti had walked out of the waiting room while Tommy was getting the car, and when he came back, she was gone. Frankie sent 12 men to search. 5 hours. 5 hours with Celeste Valenti, blind, confused, without a wallet, without a phone, wandering through a city of 9 million people where no one knew who she was. 5 hours of Nico sitting in the penthouse, receiving reports every 30 minutes, each one with the same answer. Not found yet. 5 hours in which he didn't shout, didn't give orders, didn't break anything. He only sat there, and anyone who knew Nico Valenti knew that his silence was when things became most dangerous. At 8 o'clock that night, patrol officers found Celeste inside a restaurant on the south side, sitting on the floor, being fed by a former employee before that employee was fired. An ambulance brought her back to the penthouse. She was mildly dehydrated, frightened, but she had eaten. She was alive. The doctor examined her, gave her fluids, and said there were no injuries, only exhaustion and disorientation. Nico sat beside his mother's bed, holding her hand, saying nothing. Celeste lay there, her clouded white eyes turned toward the ceiling, her hand holding her son's, and said one sentence, just one sentence before she slipped into sleep. Paige. Her name is Paige. Nico looked at Frankie. Frankie nodded, stepped outside, and made a call. Within an hour, Frankie had the security camera footage from Crossing Point Grill. It wasn't hard. Everything had a price, and the price Frankie paid was one. No one refused. Nico sat alone in the ruined office. No lights on. Only the glow from the laptop screen on the floor, surrounded by fallen books and broken glass. He pressed play. Black and white footage, the angle slightly tilted, grainy but clear enough. He watched his mother feel her way into the restaurant, watched her hand searching for the wall, watched her sit down, politely ask for the cheapest dish, search for her wallet and fail to find it, watched the manager tell her to leave, watched a customer laugh, watched the cook stick his head out, then turn back inside, watched 25 people sit in silence as his mother fell to the floor. Then he saw her, thin, tired, torn shoes. She stopped, set 2 plates of food on the nearest table, and walked straight to his mother. He watched her kneel down, watched her open the little tin box, count the money inside, pour all of it into her hand, watched her walk to the register, pay, bring the food back, sit on the floor beside his mother, lift her head, and bring water to her lips, watched her get fired, watched her untie her apron, fold it neatly, set it on the counter, and walk out. He watched it 7 times. 7 times, he looked at the 25 people in the frame and searched for someone else moving first. 7 times, no one moved. Only her. He rewound to the moment she opened the tin box, paused the frame. Small bills, coins, wrinkled, crowded together. She counted them, then poured them all out. Didn't keep a single cent. Nico stared at that image in the dark. 20 minutes without speaking. Frankie stood at the door, waiting. Every time, Nico said, his voice low, almost as though he were speaking to himself, I look to see whether anyone else steps forward first. No one does. Silence. Then he closed the laptop, stood in the middle of the wreckage he had made with his own hands. Find her. Everything about her. Before morning. Sunday morning. 8 o'clock. A knock on the door woke Paige. Not Pete Garza's kind of knock, soft and hesitant, because he knew he was asking for money from someone who didn't have any. Not the neighbor's kind of knock either, quick and careless. This knock was even firm, 3 taps spaced in a precise rhythm, the kind of knock made by someone used to giving orders and knowing the door would open. Paige had slept on the kitchen floor. Her back hurt. Her neck was stiff. She didn't remember when she had tipped sideways and curled onto the cold tile, only that when she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the base of the kitchen cabinet, and the empty Altoids tin still lying on the tabletop above her. She stood, smoothed her hair, tugged her wrinkled shirt into place, and walked to the door. 3 men stood before her. 2 wore black suits and stood half a step back, broad-shouldered, expressionless. The kind of men you looked at and knew immediately they weren't here to talk. The third stood in front, older, salt and pepper hair, a scar across the back of his right hand, his eyes sweeping over the apartment behind Paige as quickly as reading a page. Then returning to her, Frankie Corsaro. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Valenti wants to see you." "Who?" "He's waiting in the car." Paige looked past Frankie's shoulder, down the stairs, through the hallway window. A black Escalade was parked on the street below, glossy, still, the kind of car that didn't belong on this block, as if someone had cut it out of a magazine photograph and pasted it between the cracked sidewalk and the overflowing trash cans. "I'm not getting into a car with someone I don't know." "He expected you to say that." Frankie stepped aside, and Nico Valenti came up the stairs. Paige heard his footsteps before she saw him, solid, even, unhurried, each step making the old wooden staircase tremble faintly, not because he was heavy, but because the world had a habit of making room for him, and this staircase was no exception. Then he appeared at the end of the hallway. Paige saw him, and she didn't look away, because there are some people who, once they appear, you can't look away from, even when you want to. Taller than she had imagined. Charcoal gray suit, no tie, collar open. The kind of man who wore a $10,000 suit but left the collar undone because he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Dark eyes, brown so deep they were almost black. The kind of eyes that looked into you and made you feel as if he was reading the last page of your life before you had managed to speak the first sentence. A handsome face, but not the kind of handsome that made you want to come closer. Handsome the way a knife was handsome, sharp, exact, and you knew it could cut you if you held it wrong. A faint scar ran from his left temple down toward his jaw, thin, old, like someone had once tried to write something on his face, and he had made certain that person never wrote anything again. "You're smaller than I thought." People usually are. In person. Silence. Something on his face changed. Not a smile, but close. Close enough for Paige to understand that this was a man who wasn't easily surprised by anyone, and she had just surprised him. "May I come in?" It wasn't really a request for permission. It was a polite announcement, the kind of politeness powerful people used when they wanted you to feel as if you had a choice, while both of you knew the door was going to open. Paige stepped aside. He entered, and the apartment grew smaller, as if his presence took up physical space, compressing everything, making the cracked walls, the low ceiling, the old tile floor more visible, smaller, poorer. Nico didn't comment, but his eyes recorded everything. The 3 eviction notices on the kitchen wall. Walt asleep in his wheelchair, his chin fallen to his chest, the thin blanket crooked over his lap, the refrigerator hanging slightly open, almost empty, the old Vietnamese coffee filter on the shelf, the empty Altoids tin on the table. He saw all of it and said nothing, but Paige saw his jaw tighten and then release, quickly, like a reflex he had trained himself to control. "The woman at the restaurant yesterday," he said, his voice low, steady. The kind of voice used to control even when it wanted to shake. "Her name is Celeste. Celeste Valenti. She's my mother." Paige looked at him. 3 seconds of silence. She could have asked him who he was. Could have asked him what he wanted. Could have asked why he was standing in her apartment at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, with 2 men in black suits outside the hallway. But the first thing she said was, "Is she all right?" Nico stopped. Of all the questions she could have asked, that was the one she chose first. Not "who are you?" Not "what does this have to do with me?" Not "what do you want from me?" But "is she all right?" He noticed. He noticed in the way a man who had met thousands of people knew that most of them asked the question that helped themselves first, and she hadn't. "She'll be fine. Because of you." Nico walked to the kitchen table and placed a white envelope on the old wood beside the empty Altoids tin. I watched the restaurant security footage. 7 times, 25 people in the frame, 24 turned away. The manager shouted at my mother. The cook looked and went back inside. You were the only one who moved. Paige didn't react. She only looked at the envelope. I don't do favors, Miss Whitmore. I recognize value. And you were the only person in that room who had any. He opened the envelope. Inside was an official letter on company letterhead. Manager position at Seneray, in River North. Salary of $65,000 a year. Full health insurance for her and Walt. Housing assistance. And physical therapy and memory care for Walt from the best specialist in Chicago. Paige read it. Read it again. Her hands trembled, but she forced them still. I don't want charity. Good. Because this isn't charity. Nico looked at her. I've hired people with degrees, connections, resumes that read like novels, and handshakes like politicians. Not one of them would have done what you did. This isn't a gift, Miss Whitmore. This is me recognizing something money can't buy. Silence. Paige looked at the letter, looked at Walt sleeping, looked at the 3 eviction notices on the wall, looked at her mother's coffee filter on the shelf. One condition, she said. What? No one gets to tell me who I'm allowed to help and who I'm not. Nico looked at her longer than normal, longer than a man used to making decisions in 3 seconds needed to judge a sentence. Then he nodded. Agreed. They shook hands. Paige's grip was firm, he noticed. Before stepping out the door, Nico stopped. His voice changed, softer, almost a warning. Miss Whitmore, not everyone in my world will welcome you. There are people who protect their position more than they protect human beings. You should be ready for that. Paige held the envelope to her chest and looked straight into his eyes, into the scar at his temple, into the darkness behind his gaze that she didn't fully understand, but didn't fear either. I grew up on the wrong side of every important door, Mr. Valenti. I know what a lock sounds like. And it's still only a sound. Nico looked at her for one more second. Then he turned and went down the stairs. 3 floors, no elevator, his footsteps still even, still solid, but slower than when he had come up. In the car, Frankie was already in the driver's seat. He looked through the rearview mirror when Nico got in. What do you think? Nico looked back at the building through the window. Cracked walls, taped windows, 3 floors, and no elevator. Then he looked away. She isn't performing. That's the part I can't understand. Her first Monday at Seneray, Paige arrived 30 minutes early. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because 8 years of showing up 10 minutes early had become a reflex. And today she was another 20 minutes early because she needed to stand alone in front of this restaurant door and remind herself that she wasn't dreaming. Seneray sat on a street in River North where every step was only a 15-minute drive from the south side, yet as distant as 2 different continents. Exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling glass doors, warm, dim brass pendant lights, the kind of restaurant where guests brought laptops instead of coupons, the kind of place where one cocktail cost as much as a whole week of Paige's tips at Crossing Point. She entered through the back door, found the staff room, and on the small desk in the corner of the manager's office, she saw it. A nameplate engraved on metal, set on a dark wooden base. Paige Whitmore, manager. She stood there looking at it, then she reached out and touched it, her fingertips moving across the carved letters, feeling every line, as though she were reading Braille, as though she needed to feel it to believe it. She touched it a second time. Still real, still there, still her name. The first week, the work came to Paige as naturally as breathing, managing the service staff, coordinating the kitchen with the dining room, handling reservations, resolving complaints, checking the quality of every plate that left the kitchen. 8 years of carrying plates in Section 4 had taught her everything no school could teach. How to read a customer's face and know what they wanted before they asked. How to stay calm when Table 6 spilled wine on a shirt, and Table 9 demanded to see the manager at the same time. How to smile while everything was burning behind the kitchen door, and the guests still saw a perfect front. She knew how a restaurant worked, not from books, but from 8 years, standing inside the machine and keeping it running with her bare hands. The staff were polite to her, mostly. A few smiled, a few didn't. She was the youngest person in a management position, the only one without a college degree hanging on a wall, the only one from the South Side instead of some hospitality management training program. She felt the eyes on her during staff meetings. Not hostile, not warm, just waiting, as if they were watching to see how long it would take her to prove she didn't belong there. On Wednesday, Donovan Price stopped by Seneray for the first time. 40 years old, navy suit, a watch on his wrist worth more than a car Paige had never owned, a wide smile. He shook Paige's hand, smiled, and asked how she was, as if he cared. But his eyes didn't smile. His eyes measured her from head to toe, from the new shoes she had bought with the advance on her first paycheck to the nameplate on the desk, like a jeweler inspecting a stone he suspected was fake. "So you're the waitress?" Not a question, a statement. And the word waitress came with the slightest emphasis. The kind of emphasis the speaker assumed the listener wasn't sharp enough to catch, but Paige had heard enough of those little stresses over 8 years at Crossing Point to know exactly what it meant. She smiled. "Paige Whitmore, manager." "Of course." "Very nice to meet you, Paige." He said her name as though placing it down rather than speaking it aloud, lightly, but with weight, like a man used to remembering names because names were information, and information was power. Donovan Price left after 20 minutes, shaking a few more hands, talking and laughing, clapping someone in the kitchen on the shoulder. But Paige watched him pass through the glass door, and she felt something cold at the back of her neck, the kind of cold that didn't come from the air conditioning. On Thursday, Paige stood behind the glass at a physical therapy center on the north side of the city, looking into the exercise room inside. Walt sat in his wheelchair, and a young therapist was guiding him through arm movements. Slowly, lift, lower, rotate the wrist. Walt looked confused at first, frowning, his eyes lost, as if he didn't understand why he was there or who had allowed this stranger to touch his hand. Then the therapist said something. Walt tilted his head, and he laughed, a real laugh, deep from his chest, the kind of laugh Paige hadn't heard in months, maybe a year. The laugh of Walt Whitmore, the printer. Walt Whitmore, the man who once told jokes to coworkers in the print shop during lunch breaks. Walt Whitmore before the fog slowly swallowed him day by day. Paige pressed her hand to the glass. Tears ran down, and she didn't wipe them away. She stood there, her palm against the cold glass, watching her grandfather laugh with a stranger in that brightly lit room, and she cried because this was what she had wanted for him for 8 years, and had never been able to give him. Friday night, Paige met Maggie at a small coffee shop near the train station. It was the first time they had sat down and talked since everything changed. Maggie stirred her coffee, her eyes bright, both delighted and still not quite believing it. "So Crossing Point's losing customers pretty badly. Somebody posted the whole thing online. Restaurant fires waitress for helping blind old woman. It didn't exactly go viral, but it was enough to make a bunch of regulars leave. Karen's been barely holding it together all week. Brent Holloway called from out of state asking what's going on, and she won't pick up." Paige shook her head. "I'm not looking for revenge. I know. That's what makes it so good." Maggie laughed. Paige laughed too. Softly, easily. The kind of laughter two people share when the weight lifts a little. Even just a little. And you're allowed to breathe without calculating. That night, Paige lay in bed, in the apartment that was still old, still small, still with the faucet leaking every 4 seconds. But something was different. She didn't set 3 alarms. For 8 years, she had always set 3, because she was afraid of oversleeping, afraid of being late, afraid of losing her job, afraid of losing income, afraid of losing the apartment, afraid of losing Walt. A chain of fear linked from the first alarm at 5 in the morning until she closed her eyes at midnight. Tonight, she set only 1. The eviction notices on the kitchen wall were gone. Pete Garza had received a payment check from the Valenti Holdings office on Monday morning. 3 months of overdue rent, plus 1 month paid in advance. He called Paige to confirm, his voice stunned, as if he couldn't believe someone had just paid money he had already prepared himself never to see. The 3 white sheets disappeared from the wall, leaving 3 paler rectangles on the old yellow paint, like the ghosts of all the nights she had lain awake counting down. Paige stared up at the ceiling in the dark, listening to Walt breathe steadily in the bed beside hers, listening to the faucet leak every 4 seconds, and for the first time in a very long time, she exhaled, truly exhaled, the kind of exhale you don't realize you've been holding until you let it go. But there are doors that, once opened, let other things in too. Nico Valenti stopped by Senere on Tuesday night of the 2nd week, without warning. No call ahead, no message from Frankie to announce him, no reservation in the book. He simply appeared, pushing through the door at 8 o'clock in the evening in the middle of the restaurant's busiest hour, walking past the hostess stand while the young woman there only had time to open her mouth and close it again, because everyone in that restaurant knew Nico Valenti didn't need a reservation in a place he owned. He didn't sit at the VIP table tucked into the private corner, where fabric curtains and dim lights were reserved for meetings that didn't want to be seen. He sat at the bar, right in the center of the restaurant, ordered a glass of mineral water, and watched Paige work. She was coordinating with the kitchen on a special order when she realized he was there. Not because anyone told her, because the air in the restaurant changed, just slightly, almost too subtly to notice. But she had been here long enough to know when the staff suddenly stood a little straighter, spoke a little softer, smiled a little less. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him sitting at the bar, a glass of water in front of him, his eyes on her. And she didn't change a thing. She didn't walk faster, didn't walk slower, didn't fix her hair, didn't pull a smile onto her face. She kept handling the kitchen order, checked on table 7 because they had been waiting too long for dessert, and passed him the way she would pass any other guest sitting at the bar drinking mineral water on a Tuesday night. That caught Nico's attention. He had met enough people to know that most people changed when they knew he was watching. Faster, harder working, stiffer, more frightened, more flattering. Whatever version they thought he wanted to see. Paige gave him no version at all. She gave him exactly what she gave everyone else. And though he wouldn't admit it, it was the first time in a very long while that someone had made him feel not special. 11 o'clock at night. The restaurant was closed. The last employee had gone home. Paige was checking the reservation book for the next day at the hostess stand when she realized Nico was still sitting there, his second glass of mineral water untouched, the ice completely melted. "What are you waiting for?" she asked, without looking up from the book. "You don't act like someone who's been saved." Paige looked up. "Because I wasn't saved. I was hired." Silence. Nico tilted his head and looked at her. The same kind of look she had first seen in the hallway outside her apartment. The kind that read people. The kind that searched for cracks. "You're not afraid of me. Not a question. Maybe that's your problem, Mr. Valenti, not mine." Nico didn't answer right away. He looked at her. And in the dim light of the closed restaurant, in the silence between two strangers whom fate had just tied together through a blind old woman and $40, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just like the wind changing direction in a way you can't see. Though the leaves know, he stood. "Someone wants to meet you." He didn't explain further. Paige didn't ask further. She took her coat, locked the restaurant door, and stepped into the black Escalade waiting at the curb. Frankie drove. No one said a word during the 12 minutes from River North to the glass tower by Lake Michigan, the penthouse on the 30th floor. Paige stepped out of the elevator into a space larger than her entire apartment. Stone floors, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the glittering Chicago skyline below, but she didn't look at the view. She looked at the sofa in the corner of the room, where a woman sat with one hand feeling across the table in front of her, searching for a cup of tea. Celeste. Her silver hair was combed more neatly than the last time Paige had seen her. A warm, soft cream-colored sweater, no longer trembling, no longer crooked and disheveled. But her eyes were still cloudy white, still fixed on a place no one else could see. Paige walked toward her, quietly, but Celeste heard her. Blind people hear footsteps the way others read printed words. "Who's there?" Paige knelt beside the sofa and gently placed the teacup into Celeste's hand, exactly where it needed to be, so she wouldn't have to search. "It's me, Paige." Celeste's hand stopped on the cup, trembled, then she set the cup down, turned toward Paige, and raised both hands. Slowly, carefully, her fingers touched Paige's forehead, moved down to her temple, across her cheekbone, then to her chin. She was seeing Paige, in the only way she could, 10 fingers on a face, reading every line, as though reading Braille on a page she had waited a long time to open. Paige. She said her name slowly, clearly, not as a question but as a certainty. "You remember? I told you I would. I'd remember that name, even if I forget everything else." Celeste's voice was clear, transparent. One of those lucid moments in the middle of Alzheimer's fog, when her memory opened like a window, letting in fresh air, and would close again, no one knew when. But Paige's name rested in a place the fog hadn't touched yet. She took Paige's hand, tight, warm, and Paige held on too, just as tightly, just as warmly, and in that moment, the two women held hands inside a penthouse, where one couldn't see anything, and the other had never seen a place like this before. Nico stood in the doorway. He didn't come in. He stood there with his shoulder against the doorframe, his right hand gripping the wood, so tightly the bones in his fingers turned white beneath the skin. His face showed nothing. His eyes didn't change, but his hand told a different story. He watched his mother hold Paige's hand, watched his mother smile. A real smile, the kind he hadn't seen in months, maybe a year. watched his mother touch a stranger's face with the same tenderness she had once given him when he was a little boy, before her eyes dimmed, before his father died, before he became what he had become. Celeste Valenti was the only thing in this world that softened Nico Valenti, the only place in the empire of concrete and steel and fear he had built, where something living, soft, and fragile still remained. And Paige Whitmore, the former waitress with shoes coming apart and an empty Altoids tin, was kneeling in exactly that place, touching exactly that thing, with no idea that she had just stepped into the most dangerous place in Nico Valenti's life, not because he would hurt her, but because it was the only place where he could be hurt. At 11 o'clock Tuesday night, the same night Paige knelt beside Celeste in the penthouse, Donovan Price sat inside a black Mercedes parked on an empty street in Lincoln Park, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low, and even, like a man reading a contract rather than making a threat. "Tommy, what happened that day at the hospital? You don't tell anyone. Not Frankie. Not anyone. Do you understand?" On the other end of the line, Tommy Farrow, 29 years old, the driver who had lost Celeste Valenti that Saturday, swallowed. "I already told Mr. Valenti. I said she walked out of the waiting room while I was getting the car, and when I came back she was. I didn't ask what you said. I'm telling you not to say anything else." He believes that story. Keep it there. Silence. "All right." Donovan hung up. Not hurried, not irritated. Perfectly calm. The kind of calm that belonged to a man who had already thought 10 steps ahead and was now standing on step 3. The truth was this. Celeste Valenti hadn't gotten lost by accident. Celeste had gotten lost because Donovan Price wanted her lost, not because he wanted to hurt her. Donovan wasn't stupid enough to touch Nico Valenti's mother with the intention of causing injury. He needed her alive, needed her safe, needed the incident to end without anyone harmed. What he needed was the incident itself. Donovan wasn't reckless. He had detailed 2 of his own low-level runners to trail Celeste from a distance, ensuring she wouldn't wander onto the expressway or face physical harm. The plan was for them to discover her after a few hours of calculated panic, allowing Donovan to sweep in as the savior who exposed the holes in Nico's security. But Paige Whitmore had ruined that plan by kneeling on the restaurant floor before Donovan's men could execute their recovery. Donovan Price had been Nico's lieutenant for 8 years, ever since Angelo Valenti was shot dead, and Nico, at 28 years old, stepped up to take an empire still warm with his father's blood. Donovan had been there from the first day. He taught Nico how to run the network, how to manage the people who didn't appear on the payroll, how to turn $10 million in cash into $30 million in real estate on clean paperwork. He built half of this empire with his own hands, and for the past 8 years, he had stood exactly 1 step from the throne, without ever being allowed to sit down. The plan was simple, elegant, the kind of plan Donovan made. Tommy Farrow would lose Celeste at the hospital. Celeste would wander off. The security system Nico trusted would reveal a weakness. Donovan would step in, analyze the incident, propose a full security restructuring, place his own people in every critical position around Celeste and around Nico, and from there control the innermost circle of the empire without fighting for it or spilling blood. One move, clean, silent, exactly his style. But Paige Whitmore had ruined that plan by kneeling on the restaurant floor. Celeste didn't come home panicked, starving, desperate to be rescued. Celeste came home fed, warmed, held by a stranger who had taken her hand and told her not to be afraid. The security failure became a story about kindness. The hole in the system became the background for a waitress to shine. And instead of Donovan stepping in to propose restructuring, Nico invited a 27-year-old girl from the South Side to manage a restaurant, meet his mother, and sit at the bar watching her as though she were something he didn't know how to name. Paige Whitmore wasn't dangerous because she knew something. She didn't know anything at all. She was dangerous because Nico listened to her. For the first time in 8 years, Nico Valenti was listening to someone not because of fear, not because of profit, but because of respect. And if Nico began to trust someone outside the system Donovan controlled, then the system, meaning Donovan, would lose control. So Paige had to go. Not through violence. Donovan wasn't that crude. Through disappearance. By making her unreliable. By slowly choking her until she stepped away on her own, or Nico pushed her away himself. During Paige's second week at Senere, she began to feel the change. Not anything specific. No one said anything wrong. That was the point. There was nothing to point at. Nothing to complain about. Nothing to report. Only a temperature. On Monday, there was a staff meeting about the new menu. Something directly within her responsibilities. She didn't receive an invitation. When she asked, the assistant manager shrugged. Probably an Outlook error. Sorry about that. On Wednesday, there was a meeting with the wine supplier. She passed the conference room and saw 3 managers inside. No one looked up. The shared files for the monthly revenue report no longer allowed her to edit. She requested access. No one responded. A colleague smiled and greeted everyone in the hallway, then looked down at his phone when he reached Paige. Conversation in the staff room stopped when she walked in. Not fully stopped, just shifted to something else, lightly, naturally, as if it had simply happened at the exact moment she opened the door. No one said anything wrong. No one did anything wrong. The room just grew 2 degrees colder every time she stepped into it. Paige knew that feeling. She had lived with it for 8 years at Crossing Point, in Section 4, in the dead corner beside the restroom where Karen had tucked her away. She knew how to lower her head, work, not react, not let it eat its way into her. But she also knew this time was different. This time it didn't come from indifference or contempt. It came from somewhere deliberate, designed, from someone laying silent brick after silent brick around her, until the wall grew high enough that no one could see her anymore. At 10 o'clock Friday night, Donovan Price sat inside the black Mercedes parked across the street from Centeray, watching through the glass as Paige locked the door, turned off the lights, put on her coat, and stepped out onto the sidewalk alone. He watched her disappear around the corner. His face showed nothing, completely still. The kind of stillness that came after anger had turned into calculation. Step by step, move by move, number by number, clean, precise, and so cold that if you stood close enough, you would feel the temperature around him drop by 2 degrees. It took Donovan Price 3 days to complete the picture. No rush, never any rush. He knew failed conspiracies were conspiracies driven by emotion, and Donovan Price didn't have emotion. He had strategy. Step 1. Karen Driscoll. He found her at Crossing Point Grill on a Monday night, the restaurant nearly empty, only a few scattered tables left. The last loyal customers who either hadn't read the post online or had read it and didn't care. Karen stood behind the register, dark circles under her eyes, her hair not clipped as neatly as usual, her shirt wrinkled at the cuffs, the kind of woman holding everything together by sheer will while everything slipped out of her hands, one piece at a time. Brent Holloway, the restaurant owner out of state, had called 3 times the previous week. The last time, he no longer asked. He informed her. Either revenue came back within a month, or he was selling. Karen was sinking, and Donovan knew that a drowning person would grab onto anything floating past. He sat down at the bar, ordered a bourbon, spoke gently, asked after her as though he cared. Then he asked about Paige. And Karen talked. Karen told him everything. Because Karen hated Paige with the pure hatred of someone who believed all her problems had begun with the girl who knelt on the restaurant floor. Karen talked about that day, about the way she defied policy, about the way she used her own money and then acted like a saint. And then Karen told him one more thing. I have a statement. Donovan set down his bourbon. What kind of statement? After that day, I had Ray Hoffman sign a statement confirming that Paige took $200 from the register before she left. I was going to send it to the police, but then everything blew up with that online post, so I held on to it. Donovan didn't smile. He never smiled when he found what he needed. He only nodded, slowly, and inside his head, he was already running 10 steps ahead of the conversation. Karen's statement was a childish weapon. An accusation of stealing $200 that anyone who checked would see was absurd, but Donovan didn't need the statement as it was. He needed it as raw material. Step 2. Upgrade. Over the next 3 days, Donovan built the file. He took Ray's signed statement, not the original, but extracted Ray's signature and rebuilt the contents. Paige Whitmore hadn't stolen $200. Paige Whitmore had gathered internal business information and passed it to a third party. In the normal world, that was a violation of an employment contract. In Nico Valenti's world, that was betrayal. And betrayal had only one punishment. Donovan created fake message metadata on a phone, the kind of detail people who weren't tech-savvy wouldn't know how to check. Dates, times, phone numbers, brief content, just enough to suggest that Paige had been communicating with an outside party before and after she began working at Centeray. He built the timeline. Paige appeared at the restaurant on the exact day Celeste got lost, approached her, made an impression, drew Nico's attention, was brought into the restaurant, gained access to internal business information. All too perfect, too timely, too convenient to be coincidence. On paper, the story read like this. Paige Whitmore wasn't a kind girl who had happened to save a blind old woman. Paige Whitmore was someone planted there. Someone who had approached Celeste deliberately, using kindness as a cover to infiltrate the Valenti family from within. Step 3. Karen. The viewer returned to Crossing Point and placed an envelope in front of Karen. $50,000 in cash, enough to keep the restaurant alive for another 6 months. In exchange, Karen would confirm anything Donovan needed her to confirm, including that Paige had once mentioned outside people during her time working at Crossing Point. Karen didn't ask why. Karen didn't ask who was behind it. Karen took the envelope and said, "She's getting what she deserves." Step 4. Presentation. Thursday night, the 3rd week after Paige started at Senere, Donovan placed a black leather folder on the desk in Nico's penthouse office. Inside, the statement bearing Ray Hoffman's signature, screenshots of message metadata, a timeline with arrows and dates, additional confirmation from Karen Driscoll. Everything arranged in order, numbered, annotated, clean, professional, cold, as an audit report. Nico opened the folder. Read, slowly. His face didn't change. Donovan stood on the other side of the desk, arms folded over his chest, his face calm, his voice even, without a trace of urgency or drama, because he knew drama created suspicion and calm created trust. "I'm not telling you what to think, sir. I'm only telling you what I found." The call came at 9 o'clock Friday night, not from Frankie, from an unknown number. A male voice, brief, polite, in the way that left no choice except obedience. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Valenti wants to see you at the penthouse. The car is waiting downstairs." Paige stood in the kitchen at Senere, the evening shift just over, her apron still on, her hands still smelling of dish soap, because she had just helped the dish crew clear a pile of backed-up plates after they came up short-staffed. She looked through the glass door. The black Escalade was parked across the street, lights off, motionless. But it wasn't Frankie opening the car door for her. It was a man whose name she didn't know, and Frankie wasn't in the car. For the 12 minutes from River North to the tower by the lake, Paige sat in the back seat, watching the city slide past the window, and felt that something was wrong. Nothing specific, no proof, just the atmosphere. The way the driver didn't look at her through the rearview mirror, the way no one said anything, the way the call had come from an unknown number instead of from Frankie, as it always had before. 2 degrees colder. The elevator rose to the 30th floor. The doors opened. The penthouse was dark. Not completely dark, but dark in a deliberate way. The ceiling lights off, the hallway lights off, only a single desk lamp glowing in the office at the end of the corridor, casting a narrow strip of yellow across the marble floor, like a line drawn to lead her in. Paige walked down the hallway, her shoes tapping softly against the stone. The echo in the empty space too large for one person. She stopped at the office door. Nico sat behind the desk lamp shining from his left side, half his face lit, the other half sunk in shadow. No Frankie. No one else. Only him, and the face he wore was one Paige didn't recognize. Not the face that had sat at the bar at Senere, drinking mineral water while watching her work. Not the face that had stood in the doorway watching his mother hold her hand, while his own hand gripped the wooden frame. This was another face. Frozen, black eyes, flat, with nothing behind them except calculation. This was the face of a man who had given orders for things Paige didn't want to know about. The face powerful men on the South Side and in Cicero saw before their lives changed in a direction no one wanted. "Sit down." Not an invitation. Paige sat in the chair across from him, back straight, hands on her lap. The chair was softer than her bed at home, but she had never sat on anything harder than this. Nico pushed a black leather folder across the desk. Said nothing. Just pushed it. Paige opened it. Read. Her hands grew colder with every page. A statement bearing Ray Hoffman's signature. Screenshots of messages from phone numbers she had never seen. A timeline with arrows pointing from the day she met Celeste to the day she started at Senere. Each arrow labeled like evidence, like each step of a plan she had never made. Confirmation from Karen Driscoll. Her name repeated on every page, printed in bold, underlined, like the name of a defendant in a court file. This never happened. Her voice was low. Her hands were shaking, but her voice wasn't. There's a signed statement. There's a timeline. There's a behavioral pattern. Nico's voice was even, neither rising nor falling, as if he were reading a weather report, and that steadiness was the most frightening thing of all, because it meant he had made his decision before she walked into the room. Ray Hoffman's signature. The man who stood in the kitchen doorway, saw your mother lying on the floor, and went back inside. That's your witness? These messages. I've never seen these phone numbers. I've never contacted anyone. This timeline. I was at that restaurant that day because I worked there. I helped your mother because she was on the floor and no one else helped her. There was no plan. No one planted me. I had $40, and I gave her all of it. Silence. Nico looked at her. Paige looked back, and for the first time, she called him by name. Not Mr. Valenti. Not Sir. Nico. He noticed. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, then released, quickly, like a reflex he had trained, but she caught it. You watched that video 7 times. You said every time. You looked to see whether anyone else stepped forward first. No one did. She stopped. And now you're doing exactly what all 25 of those people did? You're turning away. The room was so quiet, Paige could hear the clock on the wall, a clock she hadn't noticed when she came in, ticking somewhere in the darkness behind Nico. Nico didn't answer. His jaw was hard. His eyes didn't leave hers, but he also gave her nothing more. No explanation, no apology, no admission, only silence. The kind of silence belonging to a man who had chosen and wouldn't change, even though what he had just heard was cutting into some place inside him he would never show anyone. Paige closed the folder, set it on the desk, stood. Am I fired? You're being removed. For your safety and ours. She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she turned away, walked through the dark hallway, stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and when the elevator doors closed, only then did she allow herself to lean back against the cold steel wall, close her eyes, and feel everything, the door she had thought had opened, the life she had thought had begun, Walt's laughter in the therapy room, the nameplate engraved on the wooden base, all of it slamming shut at once. Frankie was waiting in the lobby downstairs. He didn't ask anything. He drove her back to the south side in silence. Paige stepped out of the car, heard the door close behind her, heard the engine pull away, then stood on the sidewalk in front of her 3-story building, with no elevator, looking up at the dark 3rd-floor window, knowing that behind that door, Walt was sitting by the window waiting for her, even if he didn't remember why he was waiting. The next morning, she received a call from the physical therapy center. The care program for Mr. Walt Whitmore had been temporarily suspended because payment had not been confirmed. At noon, Pete Garza called. The housing support check for the month hadn't arrived, and he needed confirmation before Friday, or he would have to begin proceedings. That afternoon, she called Senare. Her number had been removed from the system. The nameplate engraved with Paige Whitmore was no longer on the desk. Every door that had opened now closed in the same rhythm. Fast, neat, simultaneous, as if someone had pressed one single button, and the entire new life she had just touched disappeared behind thick glass. She no longer had the key to pass through. Paige walked home. 35 minutes. The same road. The same cracked sidewalk. The same shoes with the soles coming apart. The shoes she had thought she had replaced. But now the new pair was sitting in a locker at Senary, and she didn't know whether anyone would send them back to her, or whether they would be thrown into the trash along with the engraved nameplate she had touched twice on that first morning. She walked through River North, past restaurants still glowing with light, past well-dressed couples stepping out through glass doors into waiting taxis, past the world she had thought, just 2 weeks ago, she had finally been allowed to enter. Then River North ended, and the south side began. As always, the border had no sign. It was simply that wider sidewalks became narrower sidewalks, brighter streetlights became flickering streetlights, or no light at all. Stores with awnings became liquor shops with bars over the windows. She passed along Michigan Avenue. The beautiful houses were still there, their lawns still neatly trimmed, their porch lights still warm, but they were no longer things she looked at and dreamed about. They were just closed doors, like every other door in her life, opening just wide enough for her to see inside before slamming shut in her face. She passed Corpus Christi Catholic Church. This time she didn't stop. Didn't sit on the steps. Didn't need to. The last time she had sat there because she was empty. This time, she wasn't empty. She was full. Full of something heavier than emptiness. Thicker, darker. Something she hadn't yet named. But it sat right in the center of her chest and wouldn't let her breathe deeply. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, opened the door, and Walt was sitting there, not by the window as he usually was, right in the middle of the room, his wheelchair turned toward the door, as if he had been sitting there for a long time, waiting, not because of habit but because he knew. He didn't remember many things anymore, but he could still feel. She stepped inside and smiled. The smile she had practiced for 8 years. The smile that cost her strength but that she still gave away. "I'm home, Grandpa. I'm sorry I'm late." Walt looked at her. He didn't smile back. His eyes were clear, bright. One of those moments when the fog parted and he was there, fully, sharply, seeing straight through her smile as if he were looking through glass. "Don't lie to me. I'm slow, not gone. Those are 2 different things." The smile on Paige's face collapsed. Not gradually. It fell all at once. Like the last wall she had been holding up with pure will had finally given way because there was nothing left behind it to hold. She knelt beside his wheelchair, laid her forehead on Walt's knee, and held his hand. "Someone said something about me that isn't true, and I have to find a way to prove it isn't true." Walt held her hand back, tight. Stronger than she expected. Stronger than an 81-year-old man in a wheelchair should have been. As if all the strength his body had lost had remained in his hand, gathered there for this exact moment, for the one person who needed it. "Truth doesn't need noise, sweetheart." The same sentence, the same voice. But this time it wasn't comfort before sleep. It was the only thing standing between Paige and the bottom. She nodded. Her face was still pressed to his knee. She nodded because she couldn't speak, because her throat was locked tight, because if she opened her mouth now, what came out wouldn't be words, but the sound of 8 years of exhaustion breaking apart all at once. She stood, boiled water, made oatmeal for Walt, placed the warm towel on the arm of his wheelchair, pushed him closer to the bed, covered him with the blanket, all by reflex, by muscle, by habit, because the rest of her had gone dark the moment the penthouse elevator doors closed behind her. Walt slept, his breathing steady. She placed her hand in front of his nose, counted, 1, 2, 3, still breathing, still here. Then she turned off the light. And this time, she didn't sit down on the kitchen floor because she was empty. She sat down because her legs couldn't hold her anymore. Her back against the lower cabinet, the same place, the same corner, the same cold tile floor, but different. The last time, after Karen fired her, she had sat here and not cried, staring at the empty Altoids tin on the table. Now, that same tin held the broken fragments of a new life she thought she had earned. This time she cried. Not quiet crying, broken crying, the kind of crying that shook her body from the shoulders down, the kind that split her breath into short, ragged pieces like someone about to choke, the kind that made her press the back of her hand over her mouth so Walt wouldn't hear from the next room. She cried because she was tired. Not tired in the body, tired in another way. Tired of building something and watching someone kick it down. Tired of every time she stood up, someone was ready to strike behind her knees and make her fall. Tired of being kind in a world that punished kindness. Tired of kneeling down for a stranger on a restaurant floor, only to be swallowed whole by another restaurant floor. Tired of believing kindness had value, then being shown that it was only something people praised but no one paid for. She cried softly. Like always. Like every time. So Walt wouldn't hear, because if he heard, he would worry, and if he worried, his memory would become more tangled, and she couldn't let that happen, because he was the only thing she still had, and she would protect him with her silence even if that silence was killing her from the inside. In the darkness, the kitchen faucet leaked. 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. The same sound, the same rhythm. But tonight, it sounded different. Not like the apartment's second heartbeat. It sounded like a countdown, counting toward something Paige couldn't see, but that was coming. Slowly, patiently, not in a hurry, exactly as Walt had said. Truth didn't need noise. It only needed time. Ray Hoffman disappeared for 4 days. Didn't show up at his new job, a small diner in Bridgeport where he had gotten a dishwashing shift after leaving Crossing Point. Didn't answer his phone. Didn't reply to messages. Maggie Dunn called 7 times in the first 2 days, each call ringing, and then dropping into voicemail. Ray's recorded voice, flat and old. Recorded who knew when. Maybe back when he was still the head cook at Crossing Point, and his life hadn't yet begun sliding downhill. On the third day, Maggie started to truly worry. Not the way friends worry. The way you worry when you know a man has signed his name to something that could destroy another person's life, and has been living with the weight of that every night, is the kind of man who might do something foolish. On the fourth day, Maggie drove to Ray's apartment in Bridgeport, on the second floor of an old brick building, with an outdoor staircase made of rusted iron. She knocked. No one opened. Knocked again. Silence. She gripped the doorknob. The door wasn't locked. Ray's apartment was smaller than Paige's, and dirtier too. Not dirty by nature, but dirty in the way a place becomes after 4 days of a man sitting in one spot and no longer caring about anything around him. Empty beer cans on the floor, on the table, on the windowsill, at least 24 of them, arranged in no order at all, like days that had been drunk through and thrown aside without anyone counting. The curtains were drawn, the lights were off. The smell of stale beer and sweat and leftover food had blended into something Maggie had to hold her breath against for 3 seconds before stepping inside. Ray sat at the kitchen table, his back hunched, both hands resting on the tabletop, staring down at a sheet of paper. Not reading it. Staring, the way a person stares after reading something 100 times, and now only looks because he doesn't know where else to put his eyes. The paper was a copy of the statement he had signed for Karen. The original was now inside the black leather folder on Nico Valenti's desk, transformed by Donovan Price into something 100 times larger than the original accusation of stealing $200. But the signature was still Ray's signature. Slanted strokes, slightly trembling at the tail end. The handwriting of a man who knew he was signing a lie but signed because he was afraid and weak, because he had stood in the kitchen doorway watching Paige kneel on the floor and feed a blind old woman while he did nothing. And when Karen placed the paper in front of him 3 days later, he still did nothing, because doing nothing was the only thing Ray Hoffman was good at. Maggie closed the door behind her, pulled out a chair and sat across from him, said nothing for a long time, just sat there, looking at him, looking at the beer cans, looking at the paper, and waiting. Ray didn't look up. Every word on that page is a lie. His voice was hoarse, dry, the voice of a man who hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 days, and had been drinking more than he had been eating. "I know," Maggie said. "Donovan came to see me, after Karen got hit with that online mess. He took the statement I signed for Karen, but he changed the content. It wasn't about stealing $200 anymore. He turned it into something bigger. Said Paige was selling information to Valenti's rivals. He told me to stay quiet, told me that if I opened my mouth, I'd end up like the last person who said no to him. Silence. And you stayed quiet. I stayed quiet." Ray finally looked up. His eyes were red, dark circles beneath them, but somewhere in the middle of that wreckage was something Maggie recognized. Not courage, not resolve, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of no longer being able to carry the weight of the cowardice he had been taking to bed every night. "I stood in that kitchen doorway twice, Maggie. Twice. I watched her do the right thing while I stood still. The first time at Crossing Point when that old woman was on the floor. The second time when Karen put that paper in front of me. Twice, I did nothing." He placed his hand on the paper. "There won't be a third time." Ray didn't call anyone, didn't record anything. He wrote. 1 page, by hand, in blue ballpoint pen on lined paper torn from a notebook. The handwriting wasn't pretty, slanted, darker in some places and lighter in others, but it was clear. He wrote exactly what Donovan had done. Came to Karen, took the original statement, changed the contents, pressured him into silence. He wrote exactly what Karen had done. Signed the additional confirmation, accepted money, provided false information. He wrote exactly what he had signed and why. Because he was afraid. Because he was weak. Because he was the kind of man who stood in a kitchen doorway and turned back inside. He signed his name at the bottom. Then he put on his coat, walked to the UPS store on the corner, and had that handwritten statement notarized in front of an employee. $4 for the notary fee. He paid in coins. He handed the handwritten statement to Maggie. "Get it to the right person." Maggie took the page, read it, folded it, and didn't go to Paige's apartment. Maggie Dunn, 33 years old, a waitress, blunt, stubborn, but not stupid. She knew that in this world, evidence needed to reach the right person with the power to use it, not the victim sitting on a dark kitchen floor crying alone. She needed Frankie Corsaro. Finding Frankie wasn't hard if you knew whom to ask. Maggie didn't know whom to ask, but she knew Senere, and she knew the restaurant had a sous chef who recognized her because she had come to see Paige twice during that first week. She left a message. 2 hours later, Frankie called back. They met at a coffee shop on Halsted Street. Early in the morning. A corner table. 2 cups of coffee. No one drank. Maggie placed Ray's handwritten statement in front of Frankie. Frankie read it, slowly. His face showed nothing. He read it again. Then he folded the paper, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and looked at Maggie. You trust this man? I trust that he spent 4 days with 24 beer cans and a piece of paper he couldn't stop staring at. I trust that kind of trust. Frankie nodded. Stood. Walked out. No thank you. No promise. Just left. It took Frankie Corsaro 2 days. He started with the message metadata in the file Donovan had presented to Nico. He wasn't a tech man, but he knew someone who was, and that person needed 4 hours to confirm it. The timestamp didn't match the network logs. The destination number had been disconnected 3 months before the messages were supposedly sent, and the metadata had been edited in a data layer the creator hadn't thought anyone would check. Fake. All of it. Step 2. Tommy Farrow. Frankie found Tommy at his apartment in Cicero at 10 o'clock at night. No knock. The door was already open once Tommy saw who was standing outside. Tommy knew Frankie. Everyone in the organization knew Frankie. And everyone knew that when Frankie came looking for you at 10 o'clock at night, you had 2 choices. Tell the truth, or wish you had told the truth. Tommy told the truth. Donovan had paid him $10,000 in cash. He hadn't lost Celeste because he was careless. He had been told to park farther away than usual, to wait another 20 minutes before coming back, long enough for Celeste, blind and confused, to walk out of the waiting room on her own and disappear into the city. Donovan hadn't wanted to hurt her. Donovan wanted the incident, wanted the weakness, wanted Nico to see that the current security system had a problem and that Donovan was the only one who could fix it. But Paige had ruined the plan by kneeling on the floor of a cheap restaurant and using $40 to feed an old woman. Celeste Valenti had been lost for 5 hours, not because of an accident, not because Tommy had been careless, but because Donovan Price had arranged it from the beginning. Frankie sat in the car outside Tommy's apartment, looking at Ray's handwritten statement, looking at the metadata report, looking at the notes from Tommy's confession. 3 pieces, 3 lies, 1 picture. He drove through Chicago in the night, up Lakeshore Drive, back to the glass tower beside Lake Michigan, the 30th floor, the penthouse, the same office where Nico had pushed the black leather folder across the desk to Paige, the same desk lamp, but this time, the man sitting on the other side of the desk was Frankie, and what he placed down wasn't a lie packaged inside a black leather folder. It was the truth, handwritten on lined paper, notarized for $4 at a UPS store, in blue ballpoint pen, by an unemployed cook who had drunk 24 cans of beer in 4 days, before finding enough courage to stop standing in the kitchen doorway and step forward. Nico read Ray Hoffman's handwritten statement. Slowly, line by line, slanted handwriting, blue ballpoint pen, lined paper, a $4 notary stamp from the UPS store on the corner in Bridgeport. He read the metadata report from Frankie's expert, the lines of numbers and timestamps that didn't match, the technical gaps Donovan hadn't thought anyone would check, because Donovan believed that when he presented something, no one dared question it. He read Tommy Farrow's statement, handwritten on another sheet of paper in large, stupid letters, telling of $10,000 in cash, of 20 minutes parked farther away than usual, of how a blind 63-year-old woman had been left alone in a hospital waiting room and then walked out into a city of 9 million people because the godson she trusted had sold her for an envelope. Nico read all of it, then read it again, twice. Frankie stood on the other side of the desk, silent, waiting, his face expressionless, because Frankie had learned 20 years ago that when Nico Valenti read something twice, someone's life was about to change, and Frankie's part was to stand still until he was asked, "How long?" Nico's voice was low, neither rising nor falling, the kind of voice that, if you didn't know him, you would think was calm. But Frankie knew him, and Frankie knew that voice was the most dangerous one. At least a year. Tommy was his man from the beginning. Silence. Nico closed his eyes. Not because he was tired. He closed them because he needed 1 second, just 1 second, to see clearly what was appearing behind his eyelids. The whole picture, complete, sharp, merciless in its clarity. Donovan Price, the man he had trusted for 8 years, the man who had stood beside him when his father died, the man who had taught him how to build an empire out of the ashes Angelo Valenti left behind, had arranged for his mother to be lost for 5 hours on the streets of Chicago, blind, confused, hungry, alone. Not because of hatred, but because of strategy. Not because he wanted to harm her, but because he wanted power. And that was worse, far worse, because it meant Donovan had seen his mother as a pawn on a chessboard, and Nico hadn't seen it for a whole year. But that wasn't what made Nico keep his eyes closed the longest. That was Paige Whitmore, the girl who had knelt on the floor of a cheap restaurant and used the $40 she had saved for 3 weeks to feed his mother. The girl who had looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're turning away." The girl he had pushed a black leather folder toward across a desk, called a security threat, removed, let walk home to the South Side in the dark, then cut off from housing support and therapy and the nameplate and everything he had given her, and taken back with one push of a button. He had betrayed exactly the person he shouldn't have betrayed, the only one out of 26 people who had stepped forward. And he, Nico Valenti, the man who had watched that video 7 times looking for someone else to move first, had become the 27th person to turn away. Where is she? 47th and Ashland. Her rent is 3 days overdue. Nico opened his eyes, and what was in them when he opened them wasn't rage. Rage was something he knew how to handle. He had handled it all his life, turning it into systems, into orders, into results. What was in his eyes was something he had no tools for, the realization that he had been wrong, not wrong about strategy, wrong about a human being. He stood. Donovan. One word. Frankie nodded. Frankie didn't ask more because there was nothing more to ask. In this world, one word was enough. On Saturday night, Donovan Price received a call. A polite, professional voice invited him to a warehouse on the South Side to discuss the new structure. Donovan drove there. He knew something was wrong when he saw 2 black cars parked outside that weren't his. He knew for certain when the warehouse door closed behind him. He knew completely when he saw Frankie standing there, arms folded, face like stone, and Nico sitting in the only wooden chair in the middle of the empty concrete floor. The story doesn't tell what happened inside that warehouse. There are things the dark keeps, and the light doesn't need to know. It's only known that after that night, Donovan Price no longer appeared at any Valenti property. His name was erased from every ledger, every contact list, every conversation. In Nico Valenti's world, there were things worse than death. Becoming no one was one of them. Karen Driscoll received a call on Sunday morning. Frankie, polite, brief, his voice even as though reading a menu. The full footage from Crossing Point's cloud camera backup had been sent to Brent Holloway and to the authorities, including the scene of Karen throwing out the blind old woman, the scene of Karen firing Paige, and other scenes Karen had thought no one had seen. Brent Holloway fired Karen before noon. His lawyer filed a report for perjury that week. Karen Driscoll, the woman who had said this isn't a shelter to a trembling blind old woman on the floor, was now looking for a lawyer no one would agree to be. Tommy Farrow vanished from Chicago on Saturday night, before Donovan even reached the warehouse. He was smart enough to know that after talking to Frankie, staying in this city was no longer an option. No one looked for him. No one needed to. Disappearing was punishment enough, and it was also the last mercy Frankie gave him by not telling Nico where he was. The payment was finished. Each person had received exactly what they deserved, in the currency of the world they had chosen to live in. Now the story moved into the harder part, because in Nico Valenti's world, destruction was easy. Building was something he knew how to do, but healing was something he had never learned. And the person he needed to heal things with was sitting on the kitchen floor of a 3rd-floor apartment on the South Side, her back against the cabinet, the lights off, listening to the faucet drip once every 4 seconds, not knowing that the truth was coming. Slowly, patiently, exactly as Walt had said. Nico Valenti came to Paige's place on Monday morning, alone. No Frankie, no Escalade, no 2 men in black suits standing outside the hallway. He called a taxi, an ordinary yellow cab, the kind with a worn back seat and the smell of a pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror, the kind of car Nico Valenti hadn't sat in once in the past 10 years. The driver didn't recognize him. No one recognized him when he didn't want to be recognized. The cab stopped on 47th Street, at the corner of Ashland. He stepped out, stood on the cracked sidewalk, and looked up at the 3-story building. The cracked walls, the taped windows, the old wooden outdoor stairs with the last step leaning slightly to the left. He had stood here once before. The last time, he had climbed these stairs as if entering any room he owned, certain, without hesitation, because Nico Valenti did not hesitate before any door in the world. This time, he stood at the bottom of the stairs and didn't go up. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. His hands were in his pockets, not because he was cold, but because he didn't know where else to put them. He was the man who had sat in a wooden chair inside a warehouse on Saturday night and looked at Donovan Price without blinking. He was the man who had built an empire on his father's blood without a trembling hand. But that morning, in front of 3 floors of wooden stairs leading to the apartment of a 27-year-old former waitress, he hesitated, for the first time in his life, because destruction was something he knew how to do. But standing before someone he had betrayed and admitting he had been wrong was something no warehouse, no Frankie, no power in the world could help him with. He went up 3 floors, knocked on the door, the same door, but the knock was different from before, softer, slower, no longer the knock of a man who knew the door would open. Paige opened it. She looked at him, not surprised, not angry, not happy. Just looked, and she didn't open the door wider. She stood at the threshold, one hand holding the door, neither inviting him in nor sending him away, only keeping the distance, exactly the distance she needed to see him clearly, without allowing him into her space unless she chose to. I turned away, Nico said. No opening, no greeting, no explanation. Just that sentence. You said I would, and I did. Paige didn't answer. She looked at him, looked into his eyes, and saw something she hadn't seen last time. Last time, in the dark penthouse, under the desk lamp, his eyes had been 2 flat black stones. Now, under the gray daylight of a Chicago morning, there was something else behind them. Not weakness. Nico Valenti was not weak, but there was a crack, small, thin, the kind of crack you only saw when the light hit from the right angle. He carried a folder, not the black leather folder from before, an ordinary paper folder, old, one corner slightly bent. He set it down at the foot of the door, beside the shoes with the loose soles that Paige had started wearing again since the new pair had been left behind at Senere. Beside the folder, a white envelope. Read it after I leave, not before. He didn't explain further. He looked at her once more, for a long moment, as if he wanted to say many things he had no vocabulary for, then turned away and went down the stairs. 3 floors, slower than the first time, slower even than when he had come up. Paige stood at the door until his footsteps disappeared completely. Then she bent down, picked up the folder and the envelope, and closed the door. She opened the folder first. Inside was everything. Ray's handwritten statement, notarized, telling every detail of what Donovan had done. The metadata report proving the messages were fake. Tommy Farrow's statement, the real timeline, not the one Donovan had built. The truth. The whole truth, neat and clear, lying inside a paper folder Nico Valenti had personally brought by taxi because he knew sending it through Frankie would have been easier, but not right. Then she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, Nico's handwriting, which she recognized though she had never seen it before, because it was written the way he spoke, clean, straight, without a wasted word. Miss Whitmore, I watched 26 people turn away and became the 27th. I am not asking you to forgive me, because forgiveness is not something I have the right to demand. But my mother asked me to find you. She said, bring back the girl who wasn't afraid to kneel down. So I am here. Not as the man who hired you, not as the man who can give you anything, only as the man who watched 26 people turn away, then turned away himself, and knows that is something I will have to carry for the rest of my life. N.V. Paige read it. Read it again. Folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the empty Altoids tin on the kitchen table. She didn't know why she put it there. It simply fit. That afternoon, Paige went to the penthouse. Not because of Nico. Because of Celeste. She called Frankie. Frankie didn't ask anything. He sent the car. The penthouse was brighter than the last time she had been there. The curtains were open. Afternoon light poured through the glass. Celeste sat on the sofa, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her cloudy white eyes turned toward the window, though she couldn't see the window. Paige walked over, knelt down. gently touched Celeste's hand, and Celeste knew her. No one needed to introduce her. No one needed to say her name. She knew by something sighted eyes couldn't teach. Paige. You remember? I always remember. Celeste set down her tea, lifted both hands, and touched Paige's face the way she had before. Her fingers moving across her forehead, her temples, her cheekbones, her chin, reading her through skin. Then she said, her voice soft and clear, one of those lucid moments she gave away less and less often now, but each time to exactly the right person. Kindness has a scent. Most people don't know that, but when you can't see anything, you learn. Paige cried, didn't hide it, didn't make it small. For the first time, she cried without fear that someone might hear her. Celeste held her. Her arms were weak but certain, pulling Paige against her chest as if holding the daughter she had never had. And Paige let herself be held like the daughter who had lost her mother 8 years earlier and had never been held that way since. Nico stood in the hallway, out of sight, hearing every word. His hand gripped the doorframe so tightly that the bones of his fingers turned white beneath the skin, and his eyes, for the first time in 8 years since his father died, were wet. He didn't wipe them. He stood there and let them be wet. That night, Nico cooked. He didn't call the private chef, didn't order from a restaurant. He stood in the penthouse kitchen, wearing a cloth apron, his hands working dough, making pasta, the dish Celeste had taught him in his youth, in the kitchen of their old house in Elmwood Park, long before her eyes began to dim and the fog of memory took her, before Angelo was shot, before Nico became what he became. Orecchiette, with broccoli, rub, and garlic. Simple. Unfussy. The only thing he knew how to cook, because it was the only thing his mother had time to teach him. 3 people sat around the table. Celeste in the middle, her left hand holding Paige's, her right hand holding Nico's. She ate slowly, tasted every bite. It's so good. Nico looked at Paige across the table. Paige looked back. No smile, no anger, just looking. And between them, Celeste Valenti, blind, ill, slowly forgetting the world, but remembering this moment more clearly than any moment in months, held both their hands and said, "This feels nice." After dinner, Celeste slept. Paige stood on the penthouse balcony, looking down over Chicago. The city glittered below. Millions of lights, millions of lives, and she was standing high above it all. The girl from the South Side, the Section 4 waitress, the girl who walked 35 minutes every morning because a bus fare of $2.25 was the same as a loaf of bread. Nico stood beside her, silent for a long time. Wind from Lake Michigan rose to the 30th floor, cold and clean. "Your mother told me you used to be different," Paige said, not looking at him, only at the city. "My mother remembers a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it still exists. Maybe it's just buried." Silence. The wind blew. The city lights flickered. "I don't know how to do this," Nico said. He wasn't talking about work, not about the empire, not about anything he knew how to handle with systems and orders and fear. He meant this thing standing beside him on the balcony of the 30th floor. This thing he had no tools for. "I don't either," Paige said. Nico lifted his hand, slowly, touched a strand of hair blowing across Paige's face, lightly. So lightly, it was almost not a touch at all, as if he were afraid she would vanish if he touched her too firmly, as if she were the most fragile thing he had ever held, and every other fragile thing he had ever held had broken. She didn't step back, didn't step closer, just stood there, letting the strand of hair slip across his fingers, letting that moment exist exactly as it was. No more, no less. No kiss, not yet, but enough. Enough for both of them to know that something had begun without either of them naming it. And maybe it didn't need a name, because real things never do. Paige told Nico the next morning, standing in the penthouse kitchen beside the sink still dusted with pasta flour from the night before. "I'm not going back to the restaurant. I want to build something of my own." Nico looked at her, not surprised, as if he had known she would say it before she knew it herself. "What kind of thing?" "A program that connects restaurants with people who have nowhere to eat. Homeless people, disabled people, the people an entire room turns away from when they walk in." She looked straight into his eyes. "Legal, clean, nothing tied to your dark side. Not $1 goes through any road I can't explain in daylight." Silence. Nico tilted his head, watching her, and she could see him calculating. Not money, but risk. Calculating whether what she was asking from him was something he knew how to give. You're asking me to fund something I can't control. I'm asking you to trust someone. Really trust someone. This time. Nico looked at her for a long while. Then he nodded. Nothing more. Just nodded. And that nod, from a man who had spent 8 years turning trust into a weapon, was the most expensive thing he had ever given anyone. Paige named the program The Floor because everything had started there. On the dirty tile floor of a cheap restaurant on the south side, where a blind old woman lay trembling and 25 people turned away, a waitress had knelt down and changed everything. 3 weeks later, Paige received a letter. No return address. A white envelope, handwritten, 3 sentences. I'm sorry. I should have stepped forward. I didn't. Signed Ray Hoffman. Paige read it, folded it, placed it inside the Altoids tin with Nico's letter. She didn't answer Ray, but she didn't throw it away. There are things you keep not because you forgive, but because you understand, and sometimes understanding is enough. Maggie Dunn quit waitressing on Friday and started as operations manager for The Floor on Monday. She wore office clothes for the first time in her life, tugged at her shirt, looked in the mirror, and told Paige, I look like I'm pretending to be a grown-up. But on that first morning, she still slipped a bread roll into Paige's pocket. Old habit. Paige's shoes were repaired. Maggie took them to a cobbler in Pilsen, an old Mexican man who knew how to stitch soles with hemp thread that held 10 times stronger than glue. Don't argue. Just wear them. Paige wore them. Opening night at The Floor. A small restaurant on the south side. An 8-minute walk from her apartment. 8 tables. A small kitchen. Warm yellow lights. Not fancy, not River North, no marble floors. Just clean, warm, and open. On the wall beside the entrance hung a small wooden sign, handwritten in white paint. Everyone gets to eat. No one has to explain why. Paige stood behind the counter, Maggie beside her, the kitchen ready, lights on, door open. The first guest walked in at 6:15, a middle-aged woman in an old coat, holding the hand of a little girl about 5 or 6 years old, her hair tied into 2 pigtails with rubber bands. The woman looked around slowly, cautiously, the way someone looks when they are used to being seen in a way that makes them want to shrink. She looked at the tables and chairs, at the handwritten menu on the blackboard, at Paige, then down at her daughter's hand in hers. I don't have any way to pay tonight. Paige stepped over, pulled out a chair for the child, looked at the woman. That's not what I asked. I asked what you'd like to eat. The woman looked at her. Her eyes reddened fast. Then she looked away, then looked back again, as if she couldn't believe the sentence Paige had just said was real. The little girl climbed onto the chair, her feet not touching the floor, looked around, and smiled. The kind of smile of a child who doesn't yet know how bad the world can be. And Paige smiled back, because that smile was the reason she had built this place. At 9 o'clock that night, in the middle of the shift, Paige stepped behind the kitchen, opened her phone, and video called Walt. He sat in his wheelchair, the new caregiver having placed the phone on a stand so he could see without holding it. His eyes were cloudy. Maybe tonight was a fog night. Maybe he didn't know who she was. But then he tilted his head, looked into the screen, and asked, his voice clear and warm, a bright moment in the long night. You fed people tonight, sweetheart? Yes, Grandpa. Good. Read me something when you get home, all right? Always, Grandpa. On the bar shelf at the floor, beside the coffee maker, Paige placed 2 things. Her mother's old aluminum Vietnamese coffee filter, dented on one side, its handle worn smooth, the only keepsake left from the woman who had died when Paige was 19 and had left her not money, not a house, but the way to brew a cup of black coffee every morning and look out the window as though the world outside was still worth looking at. Beside the filter sat the Altoids tin, empty, its lid worn, the printed letters almost gone. Inside were 2 small, folded letters. No one asked why those 2 things were there. Paige didn't explain. There are things you keep not because they have value to anyone else, but because they remind you where you came from, and what it cost, and why you must never forget. 11 o'clock at night. The last guest had gone. Maggie wiped the tables, turned off the kitchen, waved goodbye, and left. Paige stood alone in the restaurant, looking at the 8 empty tables, the sign on the wall, the coffee filter, and the little tin box on the shelf, and she smiled. Not the exhausting smile she had pulled onto her face every morning for 8 years. A real smile. The kind of smile that doesn't need anyone to see it in order to exist. She locked the door, turned off the lights, put on her coat, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. And across the street, a black car sat still. Lights off, engine off. Paige looked over, didn't wave, didn't walk toward it, just looked, and she knew who was sitting inside. And he knew she knew, and neither of them needed to do anything more. Nico Valenti protected her in the only way he knew how. Silently, from a distance, in the dark. And Paige let him do it. Not because she needed protection, but because it was how he said the thing he didn't know how to put into words. She smiled, softly, then turned away and walked into the Chicago night, her repaired shoes tapping steadily on the sidewalk, toward the third-floor apartment where Walt was waiting for her to read the paper, and she knew that when she got home, she would place her hand in front of his nose, count 3 breaths, then brew a cup of black coffee with her mother's filter. And tomorrow morning she would open the floor again, and someone else would step inside, hesitant, eyes down, saying they didn't have money, and she would say that sentence again, the sentence she had wanted someone to say to her for 8 years and no one ever had. That's not what I asked. I asked what you'd like to eat. 26 people. The same floor. The same moment. 25 people turned away. 1 person knelt down. She didn't know whose mother the old woman was. Didn't know there was a camera. Didn't know who was watching. She only saw a human being on the floor, whom no one wanted to touch. And she reached out with everything she had. $40 saved over 3 weeks in a little tin box, the only thing standing between her and the sidewalk. Walt was right. Truth doesn't need noise. It only needs time. Paige Whitmore didn't perform kindness. She was simply kind. Quietly, stubbornly, expensively, and without needing anyone to see. And that changed everything. This story is not only Paige's story. It is a reminder that every day, we all stand in a room where someone needs help, and we all have a choice. Turn away or kneel down. That kindness doesn't have to be grand, doesn't need a stage, doesn't need applause. Sometimes it is only a bowl of soup split in 2, while you give the bigger portion to the person you love. Sometimes it is placing a warm towel on the arm of a wheelchair so someone can wash their own face, because you respect their dignity. Sometimes it is kneeling on a dirty floor, holding a stranger's hand, and saying, "I'm here. Don't be afraid." We want to ask you one question, and we truly want to hear your answer. When was the last time you chose kindness, even though it cost you something? Maybe it was an apology you gave first, even though you weren't wrong. Maybe it was a meal you shared with someone, even though your own refrigerator was nearly empty too. Maybe it was a moment when you stopped instead of walking away. Tell us. Write it in the comments, because we read every line, and every one of your stories, no matter how small, deserves to be heard. If this story stayed in your heart, press the like button so it can find the people who need to hear it. Share it with someone you thought of while listening to this story. Someone you know will understand, will feel it, will nod and say, "Yes, the world needs more people like Paige." And subscribe to our channel so every day you can have another story that touches your heart, reminding you that in a world that can sometimes feel cold and hurried, there are still people who kneel down, still hands reaching out, still $40 given away without calculation. Thank you for being here, for listening, for giving your time to this story. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in your soul every day. See you again in the next story.